Thank you. We really appreciate you all being here, appreciate your testimony, and we're now going to proceed to the question and answer session. And I'd like to direct my first question to Mr. Killen. The IRS has said it planned to complete an authentication strategy by the end of 2016. However, in response to GAO's June 2018 report on IRS authentication, the IRS stated that the IRS's assurance strategy and roadmap is only a conceptual document. So what is the current status of the development and implementation of an agency-wide authentication strategy?
Thank you for that question. First, let me say that we appreciate the work done by GAO. We feel as though it was thoughtful, it was deliberative, and so we appreciate the work done in that study. And as was mentioned, we have accepted all the recommendations that were delivered to us pursuant to that audit. With respect to our authentication strategy that was developed in 2016, we have actually begun implementation. There are essentially 14 initiatives within that strategy, 14 capabilities within that strategy that we are seeking to put in place. And so, for example, the Secure Access Platform, which is the platform that we have available for taxpayers who need to authenticate, that is related to the strategy that we have. In addition, we continue to enhance and focus on monitoring of the performance of that system. We have initiated test and learn activities because one of the things that we recognize is that this is a complicated and nuanced space, and so to really continue to evolve and move the needle forward, it's going to take an all of the above approach. So there will be some things that we will be able to do on our own, some things we'll be able to build, some things we will need to engage in strategic partnerships with other federal and private sector entities, and so those are elements within the authentication strategy, and we have initiated test and learn pilots in order to sort of prove out what the marketplace has and what sort of capabilities we can put in place. So as an example, we've partnered with a vendor for identity as a service to help augment our ability inside IRS to authenticate taxpayers. We are engaged right now in a call center authentication study. We have assessed all of our level of assurance levels with respect to the former NIST guidance. Obviously, there's new guidance that has been developed now, but we have engaged in an assessment of that former guidance to try to ensure that for all of the applications that we have that are customer-facing, that they either meet the guidance as is in place or they have mitigated and compensating controls in place. Because taxpayer data protection is something that's extremely important to us. We are 100% focused on that day in and day out. So although we have work to do on the strategy, because that strategy will be evolving, because this is not something that stops. You have to continually evolve as the fraudsters and the criminals evolve. You have to adapt with them. So I do think that we have begun implementation of various aspects of the strategy. We certainly have work to do. And so we agree with that, and we're committed to doing that work because the GAO recommendations were thoughtful, and we will be pursuing each and every one of those recommendations.
Do you have a timeline in mind for the development and implementation of this strategy?
Yes, ma'am. The timeline, and so it really sort of depends on which aspect of the strategy that we're talking about, but sort of our next step is to, as GAO cited, is to do a cost estimation and prioritization. So what that means is, so the 14 capabilities and initiatives that I mentioned, our next step with that is to lay out a plan for how we will implement, how we will resource against each and every one of those capabilities within our resource constraints. But that is our actual next step. But again, that's a next step with respect to prioritizing all of the capabilities and initiatives that we have, but the work that we are doing day in and day out to protect taxpayers, that work goes on unabated, and it has not stopped. But we are looking to lay out the strategy in a sequenced way so that we will have a longer-term trajectory that we can follow against and that we can resource against as well.
Okay, Mr. McTighe, Mr. McKinney, I'd just like to get your thoughts or views on the IRS's strategy. Can you just briefly tell us what the IRS can do to ensure the successful development and implementation of this strategy?
Chairman, We liked what we saw in the strategy and roadmap. It's critical to have a high-level vision and direction. As Ms. Clean pointed out there, the strategy was pretty detailed in terms of having 6 core objectives, 10 strategic efforts, the 14 initiatives that were mentioned, and 90 activities supporting those initiatives. What GAO's concern has been is that that's a lot of work, a lot of activities. How much will it cost? What should come first? And what are the trade-offs among those activities? And the more information, the more analysis that can support decisions on what to do next and developing the timelines that you're inquiring about, we think that would further strengthen IRS's approach to improving authentication efforts.
Mr. McKinney?
From our standpoint, we're currently looking at that, and one of the concerns, the main concerns that we have is in terms of making sure that they have a full inventory of all the ways taxpayers can access either input information or get information from the IRS, and do a proper risk assessment of those. And once they do that risk assessment, put those at their proper level of authentication. And that's something we're looking at, right now, and then we'll be issuing a report. But those are our main areas of focus, is to make sure they have a complete understanding of all the ways taxpayers can get in and have that assessed.
Okay, back to Mr. Killen. Does the IRS have plans on how they will measure the progress of the implementation and progress of the strategy?
I think that is, so do we have concrete measurables that are in place right now today? I think the most accurate answer to that is no, because that is not, we're not quite at that point yet, but I think there are some direct indicators, obviously, that we need to develop, but I also think this is an area where indirect indicators will be important as well. And so what I mean by that is, so obviously the world and the space of authentication is very large, it's very broad, because for us in IRS, what that really comes down to is all of the various transactions that taxpayers conduct with us, because essentially each time a taxpayer is interacting with us to fulfill their tax obligations, for the most part, if they're requesting data, that is data that requires some form of authentication. It's just a matter of what is the level of rigor mapped against the sensitivity of the data that they're seeking at that particular time. So there may be one level of rigor associated with, making a payment with us. There may be yet another level of rigor associated with if you need a transcript. So my point to that is that assessing measures against each and every one of those transactions is something that's probably not practical. However, I think what we need to do is think about it from the macro standpoint. So one of the things that we're interested in is, for example, what is the accessibility of IRS taxpayers to be able to access our systems? What are the numbers of taxpayers who, as they attempt to access our applications that are online, what's the success rate of taxpayers who are able to effectively verify and validate and actually gain access to their information versus those taxpayers who maybe could not get into our systems because either they didn't possess the information that was needed in order for them to be able to effectively authenticate, or in the case of more fraudulent activities by criminals, what are the characteristics of that interaction so that we can use that as an opportunity to further refine our defenses. So I think my broader point is that we do need to look at what will be the measurables around that. I think we've got good measures with respect to how we're combating fraud, but that's really on the back end. So I think we have work to do with continuing to refine the measures of how are our authentication protocols working holistically, sort of looking at it from end to end. So I think we've got some work to do in that regard. And again, we're committed to doing that work.
Okay. Mr. Killen or Ms. Garza, if you're so inclined, can you, either one of you, briefly discuss how the IRS balances providing the appropriate level of security for its online tool and applications while ensuring legitimate taxpayers are able to access those when needed?
So I'll give us a start with that, and Ms. Garza can jump in. I think from our perspective, balance is something that we are I don't think that's the right terminology and the right way we want to think about it, because we really want to think about it as a commitment to both. We're absolutely committed to taxpayer security and protecting taxpayers' data, but we're also committed to providing taxpayers with tools and channels in which they can interact with us to fulfill their tax obligations. So I think what that really means for us is, pursuant to our strategy, we have to ensure that taxpayer information is protected, but we have to also provide for other channels for our taxpayers to interact with us that are rigorous as well, but that allow different opportunities for them to interact with us. So we're really committed to both. And actually, from an authentication perspective, you have to be committed to both, because essentially, if the rigor of your authentication process does not allow a taxpayer to interact with you, that does not mean that we have the luxury to not service them. So we still have to have a way to service those taxpayers that still equally ensures that their data is protected. So we don't, we're focused on security day in and day out, but we also have to be focused on providing taxpayers with access, because at the end of the day, they're attempting to fulfill their obligations. And so we have to equip them to be able to do that.
So I would echo what Mr. Killian said. Protecting taxpayer data is paramount. I think we would all agree with that. But I do believe that we have an obligation to try to provide access to taxpayers. And this is where we're looking at technology to see if there is a way for us to be able to provide the services that people deserve while still maintaining the integrity of our systems and keeping our data secure. So we're looking at it. We haven't found a silver bullet yet, but we are, there's I think either GAO or TIGTA mentioned that we had just put out something where you can use your iPhone, IRS to go, and get an authentication token that you can use. So we're looking at different technologies that will help people authenticate through our system.
Okay, thank you. With that, I'd like to recognize our ranking member, the Honorable Mr. Lewis, for questions.